Our next guest at the India Today Conclave pop-up is actually the reason we are here this evening in Mumbai. Because Ian sent a mail saying he's coming to Mumbai, and we said, okay, we must do something really special, and that's why we've set up this India Today Conclave pop-up in Mumbai. Thank you very much, Ian Bremmer, for joining us here.
I'm delighted and I'm honored. It's a great event, and I'm really pleased that you put it together.
I must tell everyone watching, whether you're here in person or watching online or on television, a little bit about Ian Bremmer. Ian Bremmer is arguably the world's foremost expert on geopolitical risk. What that essentially means is if you run a country or if you run a company and you have no clue about what may happen next, you're looking for really sharp insights beyond what's visible on the surface, he's the guy to go do. And usually he charges a lot of money for those insights. Fortunately, he's not charging us, and we have him here, and we can benefit from the genius of his insights. So thank you very much, Ian Bremmer. Here's how we see these sessions. I'll go across the world asking Ian Bremmer about things that are happening. His speciality is he can tell you probabilistically what's likely to happen next, which is why his hot takes are so hot at Davos and elsewhere. So we'll start with India and the Indian elections. Most foreigners don't really want to come to a country which is bang in the middle of an election. They just want to see the results before deciding what to say and what to do. What brings you to India bang in the middle of the Indian election here?
Well, one is that, as you know, India is one of the very few unabashedly positive stories on the global stage today. It's a place that most countries are looking to get closer to. It's a country that increasingly has a global strategy, a strategy with the global south, a strategy with the West, not quite a strategy with China, but we can talk about that. The idea that we are increasingly in a multipolar economic world, not a security world, not a technological world, but economic world, and one of those poles is increasingly India. So I don't see how you can be in global business and not regularly come to this country. And especially given that my presumption, and it's a presumption, is that this is going to be one of the more stable and uncontroversial elections in the world this year, something that Fareed and I agree about, means that showing up in the middle of the election creates some excitement, but otherwise doesn't really matter all that much.
Interesting, because you're saying there is a certain level of predictability. Those in the opposition will say, hey, that's not quite the case. We've got a real election on our hands. But that aside, we'll know on the 4th of June. What's at stake internationally? When you talk to world leaders in global capitals, how are they seeing this Indian election and the India of the moment?
Well, as I said, and we can talk a lot about what India's strategy should be, but unlike China, which is a country that has grown incredibly over the last 50 years. But that rise on the international stage has increasingly been about itself, about ideologically redressing perceived grievances at the hands of colonial powers that did damage to it, repositioning itself to its rightful place historically, whether we talk about Taiwan or Hong Kong or the South China Sea or globally, but also a country that has an authoritarian political system and is becoming more so, and a country that has a state capitalist economic system and is arguably becoming more so. India's growth story is nowhere near as spectacular as China's, but it comes with a strategy and an ideology that is not anti-colonial. I mean, to the extent that Modi has enemies, they're mostly at home. They're mostly in India. They're not global. Modi is not only trying to position India as the leader of the global south, as a very effective Indian chairmanship of the G20 help display, but also, with the exception of Canada, which I think India has mishandled, but is also a comparatively small country, India is positioning itself as a bridge to the West. with stronger relations, more durable relations with Europe, with Japan, with the United States. All of those things are true at the same time. I think that that is a value. I think it's very important for the rest of the world looking at India not to be thinking about the rise of a competitor, not to be thinking about a country that is elbowing its way to control, to wrest the rules away from other countries, but rather a country that is trying to rise harmoniously and is defining itself increasingly on a global stage in concert with most other countries. I think that's very valuable, and I think that that is a mark of stability for a country that is, in my view, likely to have the same leadership, give or take, for 15 years. That's a big deal. That you can't find that combination of things in any country that matters around the world today. You can't find it. And that's a good reason to be here. Good reason to be here right now, and it's a good reason to be here generally.
You said that there is a certain predictability about the election outcome. I want to bring you into the big political debate here about the inevitability of India's rise. Those voices from the opposition say it doesn't really matter what happens in the elections. On the 4th of June, India will continue to rise. This is India's moment. And then there are those who say no, stability, leadership, Prime Minister Modi being at the helm is important because he's the one who's helping India grow faster. From your lens, internationally, how do you see this question?
I'm in between. You talk about China +1 in India. That's your term of art. In the United States and the Europeans, they talk about friendshoring, nearshoring. They talk about de-risking but not decoupling. But they all amount to a shift of investments that diversify from China as the world's engine of manufacturing, the world's factory, to lots of other countries, of which India is one of the most attractive stories. Not the most attractive story, but one of the most attractive stories. So that helps India. But if you want to lean into that, you need more predictability. You need more transparency. You need a more effective judicial system that can actually take cases and rule on them expeditiously. You need better infrastructure. You need to fix the metro system. You need more corporations to know the India story. And you need the global order not to break down. You need globalization not to fall apart. So some of that is India's leadership, absolutely. Some of that is the global environment. Neither of those imply inevitability of India's rise. I think India is well positioned, as Fareed said, but is very far from inevitable because there is enormous uncertainty and volatility in both the future of the global order and some uncertainty and volatility in the future of India domestically.
Ian, you said India is one of the most exciting stories globally, but not the most exciting story globally. So which one to you is the most exciting story globally? And for policymakers and others who are watching at this moment, what would you like to see the next government do, no matter who comes to power, to take India from being one of the most exciting stories to being the most exciting story?
I'm not sure that Superman could make India the most exciting story. There just aren't enough Westerners here. There's not enough success stories historically here. It's still a comparatively small economy. You're on track to be number 3 by 2028-ish. That's still very far from number 2 and number 1. You also have enormous challenges in the next 10 years on water. You have enormous challenges in the coming years on climate. It is hot out. It is going to get hotter. These are not things that are fixable if you are India. It's not your fault. It's just a reality. But, you know, you ask me who else is hot, in the United States, the leading trade partner with the U.S. today is, anyone? Mexico, right? And Mexico is also having an election on June 2nd, and it's very predictable, not guaranteed, just like India, but fairly predictable. and that AMLO's preferred outcome, just like Modi's preferred outcome here, is likely to win. You only get one term in Mexico, so it's Claudia Sheinbaum. But that transition comes to a woman who also has a climate science background and understands a few things about the 21st century economy, two things that do not describe AMLO. So Mexico is becoming more integrated as almost a huge 51st state with USMCA that has incredible benefits for continuing that supply chain and infrastructure. And then, of course, another big story is the U.S. The U.S. is a very attractive market because the Americans are subsidizing it as industrial policy and building semiconductors after forgetting about them for 20 years. The U.S. is in a part of the world that is geopolitically stable. India is not. Think about your borders. You know, Myanmar is hard. Pakistan is hard. China is hard, right? I mean, the United States has Mexico and Canada. The only geopolitical challenge near the American borders is Haiti, which the Americans have decided not to care about, and they ship the people back, which is really sad and is not befitting American values historically, but is not a geopolitical instability. India has to spend a lot more on defense. Why? Look at your region. So, I mean, there are challenges with being India that don't go away no matter who you elect. I mean, that's an obvious reality.
Share your assessment of how the Indian government has handled foreign affairs over the last 10 years or last 5 years, and what are the challenges you foresee for India over the next 5 years?
Well, look, I mean, I think that I look at Modi and Abe, the strongest Japanese prime minister in modern history. And this was a guy, as prime minister, that was willing to come and visit Modi when he was running Gujarat, which was out of protocol for the Japanese. How amazing. This was a guy that was saying, I am going to build this relationship with the Japanese who don't produce anything that's poor quality, don't produce anything cheap. How is that going to work? Modi found a way to make it work and to be trusted. And that built one of the strongest relations in the G20, which really matters. Well before the Americans really cottoned on to the India story. The Quad is, of course, a big piece of architecture that really helps to bring the Indians in strategically. And yes, India is buying an awful lot of oil from Russia, which is aligned with U.S. policy. The Americans are unprepared to pay a lot for Ukraine, and as a consequence, they're not prepared to try to shut down Russian oil export because they don't want $120 oil. They don't want a global recession. But India is also working much more closely with the Americans on issues of national security, on issues of defense, both in partnership in military exercises, but also in production. Those are valuable things that have happened under Modi. So I do believe that there has been a strong effort to build out more stable, more strategic relations with most of the advanced industrial democracies. At the same time, Modi and India and their success and their willingness to have a more global face, to have a more global strategy, whether at the COP summits or the G20 or in the BRICS or at Davos, all of that has been inspirational to developing countries that don't have that capacity and don't necessarily trust putting all their eggs in a China basket, especially because China's really big, but China wants a lot of political leverage with their economic influence. Most countries in the world, like India, do not want to choose between the United States and China. This is where I have the greatest disagreement with some of what
Fareed Zakaria
yeah.
argued, and you heard him saying very strongly that he believed India would grow faster if it attached itself to the US bandwagon. Most people sitting here, those watching you, would say, no, we like the sweet spot that India is in, where it is very good friends with the United States, and we build on that deep and abiding partnership. But we also want to keep a door open with Russia. we would like for tensions to come down with China. Even if that doesn't happen, we don't want to be on one country's wagon. How do you see this?
Well, I mean, you're not in Belt and Road, so you clearly don't really want, you're in the Quad but not in Belt and Road. That's like being a little bit pregnant, right? So, I mean, the idea of Indian neutrality is a myth. But you like being a little bit pregnant. I can see this is working in this conversation because, you know, that's a whole gender identity question. But when I think about where India is going long term, my difference with Fareed is saying bet more strongly with the United States and allies when it really matters strategically, and don't when it's going to get you in trouble with other countries that matter to you, right? So when I think about the future of globalization, India needs globalization. The United States is betting much more heavily on industrial policy. You just heard from Fareed, if Trump wins, internationally, he thinks the U.S. is going to be more isolationist. Why would India want to bet heavily on that? That's dangerous to India. I think the future of the global economy will have AI that is dominated by the Americans, and therefore India should bet on it. And we'll have an energy transition that is dominated by the Chinese, and therefore India should bet on that. That's what the Europeans are going to do. The Americans put 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. And privately, the White House will say should have been 300%, should have been 400%. Why? I mean, is it because the Americans think that's the best way to ensure a green future? No. Has nothing to do with green. Has everything to do with elections, protecting labor and automotive, and making China less competitive. The Europeans are likely to put more tariffs on Chinese EVs, 20, 25, 30%. Why not 100? I mean, wouldn't Fareed say 100? No. And they're not doing that because the Europeans recognize that they don't want their people to drive expensive, poorly made EVs. Now, if the United States decides that everyone in America has to drive a poorly made, expensive EV, there are enough Teslas for everybody, right? They can do that. But the rest of the world is going to drive Chinese. It's eventually going to happen. And not only that, but the battery technology and, you know, wind and solar and nuclear, China's increasingly driving that. But the Americans are driving AI. You heard from Fareed, the top technology companies, the most innovative, the large language models. But the Chinese are not effective in large language models. Why not? Because they don't want their population to hallucinate on the back of Western technology. So if the Chinese decide that their people are not going to have access to the most incredible new technology that is creating productivity and efficiency and reducing waste, the Chinese can do that. But if you're India, you don't want to do that. If you're India, you want to bet on with American platforms for the best possible AI in the world. So my view is that globalization is not over. A Cold War is not inevitable. The global economy is not decoupling. And as long as that remains true, India should not be making permanent structural bets that cut off options. That would be a problem for India, in my view. I think Fareed and I are probably 80% aligned on this. But I think the remaining 20% is important.
You're saying on things like nuclear, solar, wind, EVs, India should work with China as closely as possible. But that's a real problem here because in areas like Depsang, Demchok, along the line of actual control, we have not eyeball to eyeball, but we have a face-to-face confrontation between the Indian Army and the PLA. How do you see the India-China equation play out? You also speak to people in mainland China. What do you think their reading of India is at the moment, and where do you see this equation go?
Look, right now the Chinese economy is not doing well, and China geopolitically in Asia is not succeeding. And that's not just an India problem. It's a Japan-South Korea problem in the northeast. It's a Vietnam-Philippine problem in the southeast. I mean, what are the countries that are getting more close to China in this part of the world? Tibet, right? Nepal, not Tibet. To Nepal, Maldives, right? I mean, those are the elections that have actually gone in China's favor. Those are not big strategically important countries. So I think that China facing economic challenges and China facing geopolitical tensions in this region wants to avoid confrontation when it can. And that creates more of a window for Prime Minister Modi and whoever succeeds him to stabilize the relationship more.
That's not held up at India's end. That's largely held up at China's end, which at this moment doesn't seem willing, despite all the cross-border talks, to find a solution to the border confrontation. Why do you think that's the case? Because as Indians look at the situation, they wonder, how does China gain from prolonging this confrontation?
Yeah, well, again, there clearly has been some willingness to talk about pulling some troops back, some willingness to talk about increasing, air travel between the two countries. I think that this is the time to lean into this. There are a lot of CEOs around the world that see that the Chinese charm offensive is because they're not in a great position. So you lean into it. The Australian government, you've seen head of state visit, now we're going to have premier visits. Why? Because Australia likes and trusts China? No. Australia's in AUKUS. Australia's in the Quad. But they're leaning into that because they see that China is likely to offer them more in this environment. Why is Biden spending the time in the Woodside Summit? Why has he asked Jake Sullivan to over-communicate with China? Why are they working on fentanyl? Why are they working on climate together? Why are they trying to keep Taiwan well communicated over and stable, and even coordinating with the Japanese and others? Because they see that China is not in the best position and can actually stabilize some long-term issues that otherwise would be problematic in a world that's very unstable. So again, if I were advising Modi at this point, I think this is a meaningful time, a meaningful opportunity to do the kinds of things that many others in the world are trying to do.
The biggest political risk globally at this moment is the election in the United States. What's your reading? All the data trackers that we're seeing here seem to suggest that Donald Trump has a slender edge over Joe Biden. Does it seem to you probabilistically that Trump's coming back?
Yeah, but my level of confidence is near zero. I mean, first of all, the elections are 5 months away. I could tell you what's going to happen in Russian elections in 5 months, right? The United States is still a democracy. I mean, it's not a very well-run democracy. It's not a very representative democracy, but it is still a democracy. So I don't know. These men are very old. We have no idea if they're both going to be alive in 5 months, right? I mean, that's still an open question. First applause line for the crowd here. Very interesting. The Indians are clearly rooting for something major to happen in the United States. I'll tell you, we don't know. We don't know. But what we do know is that this election matters a lot. And it matters a lot for the future of U.S. democracy. And it matters a lot for foreign policy in an environment where there are major wars going on, major tensions going on. The future of the United States is far more uncertain on the back of this election than at any point in your and my lifetimes.
Is that because your heart is speaking over your mind? Because if you look dispassionately just at the polling data and the average poll of polls of all data, statistically it seems Donald Trump has the edge, which would suggest that he should win.
Yeah, 60-40. Yeah. But it's 5 months away. I would say right now, 60. If the election were today, Trump probably wins. The election is in 5 months. That's an incredibly long time for an election that has two incredibly unpopular men that are running. No, it's not my heart at all. I think at the beginning of this year, I said I believed that Ukraine would be partitioned. I don't want Ukraine to be partitioned. My heart thinks that's wrong. It's immoral. It's horrible for the future of the world and rule of law and NATO and all of these things, but it's still going to happen. I mean, things that I don't like happen all the time, especially in geopolitics. But this election is too early to meaningfully predict. It is not too early to meaningfully talk about the implications.
So let's do that. What does Trump 2.0 at the White House look like for the US and particularly from India's lens? What does it mean for India?
So let's start globally. If Trump wins the election, Trump acts like the guy at a poker table who is very unpredictable, but has the biggest stack of chips. And therefore, you usually fold, even if what he's doing seems stupid. You just don't want to lose all your chips on that one hand. And so, you know, when Trump goes over and says, Mexico, if you don't improve the border situation, I'm going to tariff you until your economy is destroyed. The Mexican government, and I don't care if they like him or not, they say, okay, they fold, right? And so I do think that the border situation was more stable under Trump than under Biden for that reason. And if Trump wins again, the border situation with Mexico will be more stable again. And I think Americans have an accurate read of that issue. Now, Trump on China. We're talking about 60% across the board tariffs. That's pretty meaningful. What's the reaction of China going to be? It could be, oh my God, I'm weaker now. I can't afford this. I need to give this guy a win. I need to sit down, and he's going to look like a genius, but I need to find a way to stabilize this. They might do that. Or China might say, they're trying to contain me. No matter who's in charge, the future is thus. Trump is hated by a lot of American allies. I need to hit the Americans back hard, and this is my opportunity to work with some of the Asian allies that don't trust Trump and the Europeans that don't trust Trump. Could go either way. Do you feel lucky? Do you feel lucky? Right? Middle East. I mean, Trump was the guy that did the Abraham Accords. Trump was the guy that went to Saudi Arabia on his first trip. Trump was also the guy that pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal. Trump was also the guy that ordered the assassination of the head of the Iranian military. So Trump comes in much more likely to tell the Israelis, this is the deal, and you accept the Saudi normalization, or that's it. I'm cutting you off. More likely. Also much more likely to get into a major war with Iran that leads to massive crisis in the region. Do you feel lucky? Trump on Russia-Ukraine. Trump is the guy that is going to tell Zelensky, remember, he said he's going to end the war in one day, which is a long time, one day, right? Trump's the guy that said, I become president, I'm going to call Zelensky, tell him you accept present border, ceasefire, or I cut you off. He also calls Putin, and he says, you accept present border, ceasefire, or I really tariff you, including oil, including SWIFT, including your central bank. By the way, India's not going to like that, right? Is that going to work? Could that end the war? Could end the war. Could stabilize things. Could also create an existential crisis for NATO and a massive cost for globalization, drive the world into a global recession. So you have to recognize that when Trump was president last time, he did a lot of this stuff. But the world was much more stable. So the likelihood of major damage under Trump was low. He said, well, I didn't cause any wars, any new wars, right? This time around, Trump becomes president. He starts with 2 wars. Do you trust him with 2 wars? How about maybe 3, right? That's an open question. So that's the international answer. India should be in a good position relationally with either Biden or Trump. Shouldn't matter much. But Trump is more dangerous for India as a country that needs global stability. You want to continue to grow? You want to continue to hedge? You want to continue to bet incrementally on the U.S. more than China? You don't want Trump. Trump is more dangerous for you. That's a reality. By the way, same thing is true for China. China wants stability. You don't want Trump. You know who wants Trump? Countries that benefit from chaos, right? Russia benefits from chaos. North Korea benefits from chaos. Those are countries that want Trump more. That should give India some pause. Should make India worry, the people that are betting that. Now, domestically, you read the media in the United States, they make you think if Trump wins, it's all over. He's going to have crazy idiots around him. Not true. Trump controls the Republican Party. not Mitt Romney, not Liz Cheney, but pretty much every other Republican supports Trump, wants to be his vice president, wants to be in his cabinet. So his top cabinet officials will be adults, they will be intelligent, they will be reasonably stable.
Is it true that Trump is running a smarter campaign than he did last time?
Yes.
He just seems more in control.
Yes,
What's changed from the last time?
More disciplined. More disciplined. Well, I mean, first of all, when he first ran for president, he was a D-lister, and he could only attract idiots that couldn't get a job with anyone else. He had Paul Manafort, who deserved to go to jail and went to jail, right? And he offered to be Trump's electoral advisor for free, right? If they're offering you to do it for free, you're probably not any good, right? So this is a different story, more mature organization around him. But the danger for Trump this time domestically, last time, Trump wasn't trying to defend himself when he was president. This time, 91 indictments. This time, Trump believes, or at least he's trying to convince himself, that there are enemies, political enemies, that are trying to put him in jail. Not inappropriately. And so Trump will, as a matter of top priority, Trump will look to appoint loyalists in the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and the IRS, not only to end any challenges for Trump and his friends, but also to go after his enemies. And that will permanently erode rule of law in the United States. Doesn't make the U.S. a dictatorship, doesn't mean civil war. But it does mean that if Trump wins, and he does that, in a future U.S. election, the likelihood that the incumbents will win is no longer 50-50. 60-40, 70-30, 80-20. In other words, there will be a structural advantage for the government that controls the judges and the agents and the special agents and the IRS. That's a problem. The media, Truth Social is not worth anything right now. If Trump becomes president, it's worth a lot. And he'll still control it. That's a problem. Right? That's not democracy. So what you will see if Trump wins is that, look, you've got the United States that back in 1991 was considered an ideal of democracy. And then you've got a country like Russia or the Soviet Union that was an illegitimate dictatorship. Now, over the last 30 years, the United States, there's a lot of space between here and here, but the United States has slowly but steadily moved towards the middle. And if Trump wins, it's going to move more to the middle. And what's in the middle? Turkey, Hungary, Poland. I mean, these are countries that you don't worry about much because they're not that powerful, but they are not representative democracies. They're hybrid systems that are in between. The United States could become in between, but be the most powerful country with the most powerful military, with the world's reserve currency, with the most powerful new technology companies, but not be a full democracy. That's a very serious problem. And I don't think you can have a conversation in India about the future of India's strategy without at least thinking about that. Thinking about the fact that America is not in, Fareed said America's not in decline. But it is in decline politically. I mean, when I finished my PhD, when Fareed and I were doing our graduate degrees, everyone in the world looked to the United States as an example of a political system that they would respect. Today, you want your kids to be educated in American universities. You want to have some real estate in the United States. You want some investments in U.S. companies. Nobody around the world, nobody looks at the United States and says, I wish my political system could run like that. Literally no one in 35 years. Now, I don't think it is appropriate to have a conversation about the future of the United States and ignore that fact. I think that fact is important. It hurts me. That fact hurts Fareed. We care a lot about this, but we can't ignore it. We can't ignore it.
Does Joe Biden face a dilemma like Manmohan Singh did? Because our former Prime Minister said, history will judge me more kindly than the present. The American economy at this moment is doing better than it has in a long time. And Biden can legitimately claim that things are better now than they were during the Trump presidency. Why, according to you, did he not just step away? Why didn't the Democrats have enough institutional power to get the president to step down, which before he became president would probably be something that Biden should do?
It's not clear that stepping down would have meant that the Democrats would have a better shot. A few issues here. Number one, Kamala Harris is the vice president. No one thinks that she would be more likely to win against Trump than Joe Biden. Biden is committed to her, would have had to find a way to shunt her aside. The first black Indian female vice president. Not easy to do. Could have turned off a lot of voters doing that. Secondly, let's assume he does that. Let's assume he does that successfully. Big assumptions. Who's going to replace Biden? Don't know. I mean, there were a lot of good people out there. I look at Gavin Newsom, I look at Gina Raimondo, I look at Gretchen Whitmer. But is that the person that's going to win the election, the nomination? I mean, Biden is the president. Being president has a level of incumbency advantage. Not being president is weaker. So I agree that Biden is too old to run. He will not be able to effectively run the country for 4 full years. I agree with that. But it's not clear to me that the right strategic decision at any point was for him to step down, given what would have had to happen to create a stable transition. Not clear to me.
One of the big concerns in India is whether China will make a go for the Taiwan Straits, right? Now, how does that change if Donald Trump actually wins the election later this year? Does that make China more likely to try and scramble for Taiwan, or does that make China more wary about the US's reaction? And how does that impact India?
It would be more the latter. I'm more concerned about the uncertainty of the U.S. reaction, but the likelihood of China invading Taiwan in the near to medium term is close to zero. It's close to zero. For the reasons I suggested, this would be a massive risk for the Chinese economically, militarily, and therefore politically. TSMC still matters a lot to China. They invade Taiwan, TSMC is gone, it's toast, right? So how's China going to have semiconductors? They're going to have to rely on their own. The reaction of the international community to a Chinese invasion would be like the reaction of the international community to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Well, how has Russia done economically since the invasion of Ukraine? Not so well, except Russia's a gas station. The future of Russia's economy comes from the fact that you need the stuff they pull out of the ground. They've had 1 million talented young men flee the country and give their human capital to Georgia and the UAE and other countries. But China, they're not a gas station. They're not about resources you pull out of the ground. They need stability. They need access to international markets. This would be a freaking disaster for China. So they're not about to do it. And so I don't think it matters. I think there are a lot of things that China can do that incrementally over time improve their leverage diplomatically, economically, and militarily over Taiwan, slowly, without risking the entire stability of the future of the China experiment. But invasion is not there.
The biggest concern at this moment in the Middle East is after the crash of the Iranian helicopters with the Iranian president on board. How does that change the dynamics in the Middle East? How do you see succession in Iran, and what could be the potential impact on the conflict between Israel and the Hamas?
I don't believe that it's the biggest challenge in the Middle East. I don't think it matters much, actually. The Iranian supreme leader runs the country, as you know. The president was deeply unpopular. He will be, because he was so repressive, he was so hardline, he personally ordered the execution of thousands of political prisoners. He will be replaced with someone equally loyal to the supreme leader, to the IRGC, and to the Basij. He will probably be equally unpopular. And in 50 days, when they have the election, not many people will vote because he's not seen to be legitimate. The election is not. But ultimately, India's repressiveness, the theocracy's control of the country, of the economy, means that this is a fairly stable environment, that the instability in the Middle East comes from the nature of what the Israeli people want with the Palestinians and what the Palestinian people want with the Israelis. They don't recognize each other's right to exist at this point, and that is a very serious problem. This war is not going to end. This war is increasingly escalating, and it needs to be contained. That's the challenge that the Americans are wrestling with, largely unsuccessfully.
What are you telling your clients at this moment? Does it just continue in this fashion, or does this escalate from here? What's your reading?
First of all, I do think that the Israelis go into Rafah to a greater degree, and that leads to more civilians getting killed. I think that the proxy war from Iranian proxies in the region, Red Sea and beyond, is going to continue to grow. The Israelis have about 100,000 people that have been evacuated from the north because of Hezbollah engaging in strikes there. Think about the Israeli population. For the United States, that would be like 4 million Americans evacuated after 9/11. The state of Connecticut, the state of Louisiana. That would be the #1 news issue for the Americans every day. The Israelis either have to have peace with Hezbollah, which is not going to happen with the war going on, or they need to fight against Hezbollah to push them back from the border to get those Israelis back. I think the latter is a big risk. So as I look forward over the coming months, I see the war getting worse. I also worry that you have radicalized lots of people. The Palestinians have become more radicalized against the Jews. The Jews have been more radicalized against the Palestinian, the whole population. And that means, over time, support for more radical governments, willingness to be lone wolf extremists and terrorists that we're going to see much more of going forward. It's not a happy story.
Let's take some questions from those who've gathered over here. I'll start with Sahil Joshi. Can somebody have a mic sent across to him, please?
I have the mic. In the beginning of the discussion, you spoke about the Indian elections and how the international community is looking at it. You talked about the certainty, uncertainty, and the globalization, the relation between the outcome of this result. But don't you think that the globalization in India has now irreversible process, irrespective of whichever government in whichever form comes in India after the election? So does it even matter anymore? Number one. Number two, during the last US elections, what we saw is that our Prime Minister had visited US before the campaign started. And while speaking to the Indian Americans, he had said, "Ab ki baar Trump sarkar." You know, this time there should be a Trump government in US. How do you look at that when now again we will be seeing Trump versus Biden in US?
Look, I think that Modi personally has done well with Biden, and Modi personally has done well with Trump. And it's certainly possible that Modi individually feels a greater sense of kinship for Trump, who was there with the Howdy Modi event and 100,000 people and everybody going wild. And they do both have more of a populist streak. And Biden is a more traditional political figure. So I get that. But I just go back to my point that the level of uncertainty on the global stage does not support India, irrespective of Modi's personal predilections. Now, the first question you had was about...
I asked about whether the outcome of the Indian elections, does it even matter from the perspective of whether the uncertainty of globalization process, because it's already there and it is kind of irreversible. We have seen many governments coming and going, but the process is still on.
I certainly think that globalization has made significant strides in India. Infrastructure has improved, literacy has improved, the bureaucracy has become more streamlined, it's easier to get benefits to people. I mean, all of those things are very positive. The VAT system, I mean, there are a lot of things now about India that makes it a country that's easier to do business in and more attractive. As I said, this global environment is hard. It is volatile. It is dangerous. India today is the 5th largest economy. There is massive inequality in India. That is a challenge for India going forward. There are a lot of people in India that are going to face enormous problems. You've got a small number of very wealthy Indians. You've got a large number of Indians that are living at sub-Saharan African life quality and standards. And I don't know how India responds to running out of water when that happens. I don't know how India responds and I don't know how many of you read Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future, very important book about what happens in the world when we don't address climate change adequately. India is ground zero for that. A lot of people are going to get displaced. A lot of people are going to die. And that's not really fair because the West are the ones that industrialized and put out all of the carbon, right? And per capita, okay, China may be more than Europe right now, and overall they're more. But historically, which is what matters, historically is what got us to 1.2 degrees, it's the West. But the West is not willing to pay for loss and damages for India. They're just not. That's not fair, but it's reality. So look, if the world had global government and the world had alignment for 8 billion citizens and treated them equally, I would feel very optimistic about the future of India. But it doesn't. And as a consequence, you've got 1.5 billion people that want to become middle class at a time when the world is not aligned towards that happening. That's a very serious problem. So I don't think it's good to talk about the inevitability of India's anything. This is a time when you've got to work harder. This is a time when every gain that you get is going to be harder fought. It's going to be more challenged. It's going to be much tougher. And young people are going to get angry about that. So we need to recognize that we're in the first quarter here. We're not in the fourth quarter. We're not in the, it may feel like the first quarter. It's the first quarter. It can be the fourth quarter for the Americans who are already rich and can screw up a lot. You know, you heard Fareed say American political institutions are strong. He's right. They're strong. You don't have to worry about civil war because there's so many ways that you can screw up. We had January 6th in the United States. So embarrassing. So embarrassing. And that night, a majority of Republicans in the United States, in the House, voted not to certify the election for personal selfishness because they focused on their job and their party before their nation. And they could afford to do that because America is rich and stable and strong and resilient. Don't think India can afford to do that. You can't. You can't. The Americans can do stupid for decades. Winston Churchill said the Americans do everything else before they do the right thing. You can't get away with that, India. So let's not pretend.
Okay. Anand Goenka is the vice chair of the RPG Group, one of our large business conglomerates. Can we have a mic sent across to him, please? Anand?
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Ian, for your deep insights. How do you see AI influencing politics and nations and elections in the longer term?
One of the most interesting things about the world today, I've been a political scientist for 30 years. And over the course of my studies, I always believed that democracies and open political systems were more stable than dictatorships and closed political systems. I also believed that well-regulated, competitive free markets would bring more growth and success economically than monopoly systems, state capitalist systems. I think that AI in the next 5 years challenges both of those assumptions. It is now possible that closed political systems will become more stable than open political systems as we look at the future of AI. It's possible as we have surveillance systems and data and human beings intermediated algorithmically, for good and for bad. It is also possible that as AI has the ability to consolidate data and create greater efficiency and productivity and reduce waste, that monopoly systems economically, either in the private sector or in the public sector, could be more efficient than competitive, smaller, creative destruction in the free marketplace. I am not yet willing to flip my bet, but I know that I'm uncertain because of the future of AI. That is another reason that if you are India, you would be unwise to make irreversible bets at this level of uncertainty around the future of what kind of economic and political systems will be dominant in the coming global order. I think this is a hugely important point that is underappreciated by people that have studied the Westphalian system. because we're not sure how durable the Westphalian system is.
We'll take some questions from the students from Galgotia University. This gentleman has his hand up. Yeah, go on.
A very pleasant evening, sir. I'm Devansh, law student from Galgotia University. So carrying on to what you said, sir, that Ukraine might get split this year. So as far as I know, this was one of the problems that you mentioned in top 10 problems for the world to face in this year. Now, since we're in the midway of this year, sir, and we have seen multiple things that have changed, is there any change that you think might happen, and what would be its effect on India diplomatically in its global relation with the West and with the Russia as well?
Yeah, I mean, so far the last 6 months have gone about as we expected in our top risk piece. Ukraine's counteroffensive had not gone well. They are now losing momentum because the Americans dithered for 6 months in the decision to provide ammunition that the Ukrainians needed. Also because the Ukrainians are running short of manpower and mobilization, especially trained soldiers, and because there just isn't enough air defense to allow the Ukrainians to ensure that they can keep the Russians from destroying their cities. This is why the Ukrainians are getting more desperate. It's why they're hitting targets inside Russia. It's why they're calling for boots on the ground from NATO. I do think going forward that the outcome for Ukraine is looking worse and worse. And it's possible that the Russians might be able to win the war in Ukraine. But this doesn't mean that Russia is going to be stronger globally. NATO will be stronger. The good news, and it's not good news for Ukrainians, but the good news is that finally, watching the Ukrainians start to lose and watching the United States lose interest in Ukraine has gotten the Europeans to take this much more seriously. It's gotten the Europeans to talk about a NATO pillar and spend not 2% of their defense GDP, but maybe 3% or more, which they wouldn't have done 6 months ago or 12 months ago. It looks at the Europeans just yesterday announcing that they will use the frozen assets of the Russians, will use the interest to start rebuilding Ukraine and supporting them militarily. 3 months ago, Europe wasn't going to do that. What's changed? Well, what's changed is that the situation for Ukraine is urgent. My last book was called The Power of Crisis. And I said sometimes you need a crisis that is big enough that it forces you to take conflict seriously. The Russians invaded Georgia in 2008. Nobody cared. They invaded Ukraine in 2014. Not enough people cared. They invaded Ukraine in 2022. What was the response? The response was NATO called the Ukrainian president and said, we'll send you a plane, we'll get you out, just like they did with Ashraf Ghani in Afghanistan. And if the Ukrainian leader had done what NATO expected, he would have gotten out, Ukraine would have fallen. So the revealed preference is that the crisis wasn't big enough for NATO to take itself seriously. The crisis is now big enough for NATO to take itself seriously. And if the Europeans put that money in, even if Trump is president, he's going to say, look at the Europeans, now they're spending more. You know why? Because of me. He takes a victory lap. He's the guy that saved NATO. And you know what Macron says? Thank you, Mr. Trump. Right? That's what they say. Why? Because he's got the big stack at the poker table. They don't like him, but they're not stupid. Right? And so there is a level of that playing out.
The last 1 hour, and I'm sure all of you sitting here will agree, has been an absolute masterclass on geopolitics, and we are very delighted that you could take out time and join us here. And I hope that you keep coming back and taking out more and more time to be with us at events like these. Thank you very much, Ian
Such a
Bremmer.
pleasure, man. It's great to see you.
Absolute pleasure to have you. Thank you so much. Can we have a very warm round of applause for Ian Bremmer for really lighting up this evening with his insights. Thank you very much, Mr. Bremmer. Thank you.